Okay, so before we get started on the lecture, I will post the midterm exam by the end of the day. It will be due in 1 week. It's an open book, short essay exam, and you'll just post it in Blackboard by the end of the day on the 8th. So I'll post it hopefully right after class, but no later than the end of today, and you'll have a week to do it. Are there any questions on the midterm? Yes. Yeah. 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 On the 8th, so a week from today, by 11:59 p.m. Yeah, it's short essay questions and it's open book, open notes, etc. Yeah, usually it's a take-home exam when we're in a regular class, but obviously with the pandemic, it's basically kind of an online open book exam. Okay. So we're going to start talking about political participation. This is especially relevant right now with the upcoming presidential election. So we're going to talk about forms of participation and a little bit about who votes and who doesn't. All right, so usually people do traditional forms of participation. And so what this is essentially activities we do to influence our government, our politics, and our policy. So it's essentially the activities we're doing to try and change laws or ask Congress to work on something. And so one form that's used fairly often is protest, right? Used very successfully in the civil rights movement. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not. Occupy Wall Street was not effective. They didn't have a coherent message, a coherent leadership, a coherent strategy. It was basically people protesting the fact that the banks and Wall Street caused the economy to collapse in 2008, and nothing really being done about it, but they didn't have a clear message, so the movement fell apart pretty quickly. Black Lives Matter, on the other hand, has been a bit more successful. After the shooting in Ferguson, there were protests in over 170 cities. We've seen protests in Chicago, New York, Houston, Portland, and so on. The majority of the protests have been peaceful. Statistics show about 97% of the protests have been peaceful. But of course, we do hear about the ones that get out of hand, like Kenosha and so on. And they've been somewhat successful in getting reforms like the use of body cameras, banning chokeholds, things like that. So it's still a movement that's kind of finding what they can do, but it's been pretty effective. But for most people, their form of participation is voting, showing up on election day. Voting doesn't cost anything. It's relatively easy. You may have to wait in line for a little bit, but it doesn't cost you money. And you can be pretty quickly in and out of a polling place. So for most people, if they participate in the system, it'll be showing up on election day, showing up to vote and leaving. You can also participate with things like donating money to a candidate, buying a yard sign, signing a petition, going to a meeting or a campaign rally. But these do, of course, take time and money. You have to have money to be able to donate to a candidate. You have to be able to take the time to go to a campaign rally, to attend a meeting. So they're not as popular. Voting is pretty straightforward. Go in, punch your ballot, and leave. So again, most people will participate through voting. Some people will go a step further and show their support for a particular candidate. Along the border, I've seen a few yard signs for Trump and Biden. So people are actually kind of showing more of their support in this election. All right, so in terms of voting, in the 19th century, voting was basically limited to white men. Originally, it was white men with property, who were Christian. Then it became expanded to white men who didn't have property. But essentially, up until about the Civil War, only wealthy white men were able to vote, able to participate in politics. So it took the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote, and the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote, that we saw more expansion of voting, that we saw more participation in the political system. Keeping in mind, of course, the fact that just because black men and women had the right to vote didn't necessarily translate into them actually voting or being able to vote. So it took the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to truly give African Americans the ability to actually vote. They had to eliminate the poll tax. They had to make it clear that voter suppression based on race was not going to be tolerated. So this is where we saw more participation. And then finally, in 1971, they lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And this was done because this was at the height of the Vietnam War. And you had a lot of young men saying, if I'm old enough to be drafted and sent to war, how am I not old enough to vote for president? I'm being sent to a war that I have no say in, that I didn't vote for, by a president I didn't get to choose. So it was pretty clear, right? If you're old enough to be drafted into the military or sent to jail for life, you're old enough to vote, right? So they lowered the voting age as a way to kind of channel that anti-war anger into the polling stations. You don't like President Nixon? Vote against him, right? You don't like your senator? Vote. So the idea was, let's try to channel it into a more peaceful form of protest. Get young people out to the polls. But again, just because you have the right to vote doesn't necessarily mean that you actually will vote. We're lucky to see maybe 60% of registered voters or eligible voters showing up in a presidential election. Lucky if we see anywhere near 40% for a midterm election. The majority of Americans don't actually vote. It's pretty low voter turnout, especially because with midterm elections, which is where we re-elect the entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate, most people say, well, it's not a presidential election and I just don't care. So they don't necessarily show up unless they're motivated to vote one way or the other. So voter turnout is pretty low. It was 58% in 2012 and a little under that in 2016. So you're looking at about 40% of eligible voters who didn't show up on election day. And this is important because that's millions of votes that could have changed the outcome of the election. It was the Electoral College that decided who won, right? And part of that was because voter turnout was pretty low. So unfortunately, it did have an impact on the election. In other countries, we do see higher voter turnout. It's about 87% in Belgium, 86% in Sweden. And it used to be as high as about 65% voter turnout here in the US. Part of the reason it's higher in other countries is, in some countries, it's mandatory to vote. If you're eligible to vote and you don't, you can get a penalty. Some countries automatically register you to vote when you turn 18 or whatever the year of eligibility is. They also hold the election over a weekend, or they make it a national holiday. If you don't have to go to work, if you don't have to go to school, then you might be more likely to show up to vote. So with the midterm elections, there was 36% voter turnout in 2014, but 49% 2 years ago. That was the highest it had been in several decades for a midterm election. Part of that was because of anger on both sides. Democrats who didn't like what they were seeing in Congress. Republicans who didn't want Democrats taking control. So we saw higher levels of voter turnout. And the Democrats took back control of the House of Representatives because they showed up in larger numbers. It'll be interesting to see how many people show up to vote this time around. If more Democrats show up, if more independents show up, or if we see roughly the same turnout as we did in 2016. We do see lower turnout for non-college educated and poorer Americans. Part of it is if nobody ever tells you, here's how you register to vote, here's how you find your polling place, you're not going to show up on election day. If you're someone working multiple jobs, right, you may not have time on election day to go from school to the polling place to work, or job 1 to job 2. So it does make it harder for lower income Americans to participate in the system. And it doesn't help that the candidates don't reflect us, right? They tend to be older, wealthy, white, and male. But that's not the majority of the American people, right? It's a very small percentage of Americans who are millionaires, but it's mostly millionaires who run for president, who run for Congress. If you have constantly white candidates running in minority-dominated areas, how do you expect people to show up to vote? So if you're not reflecting in the community, it does make it harder for people to want to show up and vote for you. And it certainly doesn't help in this election that we've got two 70-something-year-old men, right? Not exactly very confidence boosting, right? There's a lot of concerns about their health, mental ability, things like that. Okay, so we can participate in traditional ways like going to a rally or posting a yard sign, but we can also participate online. And we do tend to see more participation digitally because there's more feedback, right? If you're just watching TV or reading the news, there's no interaction. But if you're on a website and you're sharing your comments with people, you get that interaction, that feedback, that ability to say, people in my community feel the same way about this. And it's also useful because it helps with getting out the vote. 1 in 3 social media users have encouraged people to vote. So if your best friend goes on Facebook and says, hey, guys, let's all make a pact, let's all go vote on election day. Or your neighbors on next door post a thing saying, hey, a group of us are going to carpool over to our polling place who's in, you're more likely to participate, right? You're going to get that encouragement and that incentive to show up to vote. If your coworkers say, hey, let's all take our lunch break together and go vote, that can make a difference as well. And it's also a way to share your thoughts. How you feel about Biden and Trump, how you feel about immigration, healthcare, and so on. There's a lot more participation online. And we find that Americans who make less than $75,000 a year are more likely to use social media to participate. They can't necessarily afford to make a campaign donation, but they can post a story or an image to their Facebook or Instagram account. They can retweet someone. It's not going to cost them anything to repost an article. And so we do see a lot more looking for information about elections online. 61% of voters in 2012 looked online for information about the election. Wanted to know what Mitt Romney was saying, what Barack Obama was saying, what the polls looked like, and so on. In 2012, it was 27% of registered voters who used their cell phone for electing news. Keeping in mind that at the time, a lot of the cell phone companies weren't offering free data with every phone. Nowadays, of course, it's the majority of the voters will pull out their phone and look up something online. The rise in smartphones has made participation even easier. You can just go on Facebook on your phone and comment on something. It's much easier to participate in some form or another. Okay. And the good thing about digital participation in a lot of ways is that it does increase the likelihood of voting. And there's 4 reasons for this. First, you can get information and news online 24 hours a day, right? You have a case of insomnia at 3 a.m. and you're going, I wonder what Trump has to say about tariffs, right? You can go online and you can look up that information. Or I wonder what my representative is working on right now. So it's a lot easier to stay informed. The second reason is a lot of campaigns have started placing ads on social media. Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. And so even if you're not necessarily interested in the election, you're still getting exposed to information. You're still learning about the candidates. So you may find yourself paying attention anyway, going, well, that was an interesting little ad I just saw. Let me look into this a little bit more. The third reason is it can help create an emotional response, right? A candidate can run an ad saying, my opponent is anti-American because he supports NFL players kneeling. And then someone responding with a veteran saying, no, that's a protected right. And so you can get people going back and forth and feeling one way or the other, saying, wow, that candidate's a real jerk, or I actually kind of agree with that. And then they start kind of getting involved in the discussion. And the fourth reason is it doesn't take as much effort to participate online. Again, you have participated if you've ever retweeted someone, shared an article or a video, posted a photo on Instagram. And it's very easy, right? It takes, 10 seconds to retweet something at most. So it's a lot easier to participate online. It doesn't cost you anything, and you can show your support or opposition very easily. We are seeing more forms of political expression, blogs, social media, candidates having their own websites like BernieSanders.com or Donald Trump for president, things like that. So it's easier to see what people are up to, what the candidates are doing, schedules of appearances, things like that. Also, the ability to express your views online through the use of things like hashtags. When Obergefell was decided allowing same-sex couples the right to marry, people posting rainbow emojis or the hashtag love wins, things like that. So using a hashtag to celebrate something you see as positive, or when a couple hundred schoolgirls were kidnapped in Syria, the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls was very popular on Twitter for a while and was actually used by First Lady Michelle Obama. So it's a way of kind of staying connected to an event or a movement. And it's also helpful for the candidates. It's cheaper to run an ad on YouTube than on the local news station. And you reach a much broader audience. You no longer have to buy ad time in Chicago or St. Louis or Denver. You can just go on YouTube and it'll be nationwide, even national. It's a lot more cost efficient, right? You don't have to pay as much for television ads. You can hire someone to run your social media, keep people up to date, get new voters coming in. Bernie Sanders was very, very good at that in 2016 and this last time around. He raised all of his money through individual donations. So for the use of online campaigning, he was able to raise hundreds of millions of dollars through $20, $30 contributions. And the movement was very grassroots-based, young people sharing information. This candidate won't take money from special interests. This candidate wants to look at issues with student loan debt. Take a look at this candidate. So it's beneficial in a lot of ways. It helps us and it also helps the candidates. So it's kind of a win-win. Any questions, comments? Yes, everyone's good? Okay. But of course, there's always drawbacks, right? It can be very beneficial, but it can also be problematic. We do see a problem with what's called the echo chamber effect. You get social media sites only showing one side of the argument. Facebook pages like the Proud Boys, well, they're not allowed on Facebook anymore, but right-wing groups are going to post one thing, left-wing groups are going to post another. And so there's this hyper-partisanship, this polarization that happens. There's also the fact that a lot of people aren't willing to look at contradictory information. They're not willing to hear that an article on CNN contains some factual errors, or an article on Fox News was not quite accurate. They're going to dismiss this information and say, well, that's just someone who doesn't like this website. They're clearly wrong. A lot of arguments, right? A lot of people trolling each other, nasty comments, you're a fascist, you hate America, you're an ugly, fill in the blank, right? There's a lot of nastiness as well. Someone can post one comment and then it gets a couple hundred responses that get increasingly ugly. So that can be a problem as well. There's also the problem with the huge amounts of false information and propaganda that we saw in 2016. And then we are somewhat seeing, again, we're seeing cyber bots, people in Russia using fake accounts to post false information. In 2016, they were posting things like when Hillary Clinton collapsed at the 9/11 memorial, they said, oh, she has cancer, she's really ill, when the reality was it was over 100 degrees that day and she had pneumonia. You pretty much guaranteed you're going to collapse in those conditions, right? People posting things that she was part of a pedophile ring run out of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria, right? They called that Pizzagate. Telling Bernie Sanders supporters, write him in as a candidate, he could win. So false information like that, that did play a big role in the election. Facebook is trying to crack down on that. They recently announced that because we won't likely know who won the election on election night because of the mail-in ballots, that they are not going to allow posts that falsely declare Biden the winner or Trump the winner. They're also cracking down on false ads. They took down a false ad recently, so they're trying to crack down on that. They're also trying to reveal where a page is located. So if it's a page like Bernie Sanders supporters, but it's based in Russia, you probably know that's not going to be real, right? It's not going to be accurate. Twitter is also trying to cut down on the number of bots, fake accounts posting contradictory information. Instagram trying to work on it. So they're trying to limit the amount of false information going into this election. But some of it's going to seep through anyway. I mean, you can't stop absolutely everything from filtering through. but they're trying at least. And they found that false ads on Facebook posted by Russian operatives reached 126 million Americans. So it was a really big problem in 2016. And the other problem you see is that you can't reach a voter who doesn't have home internet. So it's harder to reach very poor Americans, senior citizens, and others. So it's useful in some ways. But again, you have to be careful what you're looking at. You got to verify what you see on social media. Try to find out if an article is actually true or not before you comment or share it or so on. I'm sure some of you have seen those comments on Instagram where you're like, clearly this person is like not real. This is just like a fake account that keeps posting the same crap over and over again. Okay, so why don't people participate, right? Why is it that we don't actually see people showing up? Well, for most people, it's a cost-benefit analysis. The benefits have to outweigh the costs. So the likelihood of your candidate winning has to outweigh the cost of calling in sick to work, or hiring a babysitter, or leaving work early to go vote. And for some people, that's just not worth it, right? They look at that and they're like, it's not worth it to me. You know, if my candidate wins, great, but I can't afford to take the time off. I can't afford to leave my kids at home, or miss a class, or, you know, call in sick to work, right? So for a lot of voters, they look at that and they're like, it's not logical. One vote is probably not going to decide the outcome of the election. So logically, right? I mean, it's not going to come down to one vote, potentially. So people look at that and they're like, it's just not worth it. There's also the very practical issue of, can you get to your polling place on election day? Again, if you're working multiple jobs, or if you are ill, if you have a disability, going out on election day can be challenging. This election, of course, we're facing the special issue of COVID. What do we do about trying to protect voters on election day? Some states have said you can request a mail-in ballot, no questions asked. Other states are saying COVID's not a valid reason, you still have to show up in person. And so you get into the question of, do you feel safe showing up to vote? And that's a question a lot of people are going to have to ask themselves. It also depends on where you live. We do tend to see a little bit lower voter turnout on the West Coast. California is 3 hours behind New York. So if there's a clear lead in the states that close earlier, voter turnout is going to be lower on the West Coast. So if the media says at 8 p.m. East Coast time, we already know who won, then voters in California, where the polls are still open, aren't going to show up, right? Why vote if you already know the outcome of the election? It's why it gets kind of testy when they do that. And like, you shouldn't be declaring anyone a winner until all of the polls have closed, right? Don't go telling people clearly Trump is going to win, or clearly Biden's going to win. No, don't be playing that game. Give people on the West Coast a chance to show up to vote. Okay, rant over, but it just annoys me. It's like, no, don't be saying someone won if you don't know that for sure. And the other problem is, if you're in what's considered a safe state, Why would you bother to show up? If you're a Democrat in Illinois, it's a blue state. You're not going to go vote. If you're a Republican in Oklahoma, it's a safe state. Why should you show up to vote, right? It's the states that are considered swing states, the battleground states, where you do see higher voter turnout. Iowa, Florida, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. There's more incentive because your vote can decide which way the state goes. Florida went blue in 2012, red in 2016. We don't know which way it's going to go this election. So the voters in those states are more likely to show up because they are going to feel like their vote matters. It's not a safe state. You have more incentive to show up. You also get campaign ads 24/7. 2016, I was living in Florida, and I swear to God, at least 2 months before the election, every other ad was a campaign ad. I got so freaking sick of it, I was ready for the election to be over. But that's what they get. They get inundated with visits and flyers and ads. So they are more likely to show up. They're more likely to feel, you know what, my vote will make a difference in the outcome of the election. Texas used to be considered a safely red state, but the polls are going back and forth this election. So Texas might actually be a swing state this time around. We may see going forward that the candidates do pay more attention to Texas. If Texas becomes a swing state, we may see higher voter turnout. I actually saw an article the other day that said that Texas has had the highest voter registration numbers of any state. That's a pretty good sign, right? We've had a record number of people registering to vote. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll show up on election day, but it is a pretty good sign that people are actually registering to vote this time around. If you meet certain conditions, COVID is not. COVID is not considered a special condition. You have to be out of the state, actually ill or disabled. Otherwise, no. They're telling you that's not, fear of COVID is not a valid excuse. You still have to show up. But you can early vote to try and avoid that. But no, Texas has said COVID is not a valid reason to request a mail-in ballot.
I would states, some states that are very cautious, well, everybody's supposed to be very cautious, and it's supposed to be within the 60 or whatever. But yet, Trump's having his voter fraud, people go and show up and act.
Yeah. What they're doing is you do have to request a ballot. Obviously, they want to make sure that it gets to the right person. Sorry?
The poll watchers, that's the...
Oh, the poll watchers. Yeah, that's an interesting problem, isn't it? I don't know what they're going to do about that. To be a poll watcher, you do have to go through training. You do have to be nonpartisan. And you can't deny someone the right to vote unless it meets certain criteria. So if a bunch of Trump people showed up and they were like, we're not going to let Democrats vote, they would probably be asked to leave. You're not allowed to campaign within 100 feet of a polling station. So they can't actually sit inside the polling station and try to intimidate people. That's against the law. If either side tries that, their people will be escorted outside and maybe even arrested for that. In terms of trying to keep poll workers from being particularly biased, I mean, it's impossible in some ways to know that, but there are numbers people can call if they think voter suppression is happening. The Federal Election Commission, they can talk to the parties in their area, and so on. So in 2016, when I went to vote, in Florida, you do have to register with the party. So I was registered with a party, and I went in on election day, and the lady looked at me and she's like, well, your signature doesn't match your driver's license. Nobody's signature matches their driver's license, right? I mean, this little scribble thing, no. So she made me re-sign for it twice before she'd let me vote. And so I called one of the local parties and I filed a complaint. I'm like, I think she's trying to discourage voting. And I was like, you can't have that happening, right? You can't have her telling people your signature has to match perfectly. It's never gonna match perfectly. My ID was valid, my voter registration card was valid. You can't have that happening. So if there is a problem, they can try to deal with it. But to your other part of the question about the mail-in ballots, some states vote entirely by mail. Oregon mostly does mail-in elections. The rules on that are going to be if you request a mail-in ballot, it has to be back to the election place on or before election day. So if you forget to mail out your ballot until November 3rd, it's not going to be counted. If it gets there on November 4th, it's not going to be counted. So your mail-in ballot would have to arrive on or before election day. Counting them is going to be an interesting challenge. They're going to have to have a lot of people to sort through the ballots. There's probably going to be people overseeing the counting to make sure they're not trying to tamper with the numbers. But in all likelihood, we're not going to know who won on election night. We probably won't know for at least 2, maybe 3. And that depends on whether or not there's legal challenges as well. This is going to be a very difficult election.
Is what Biden said that as long as it was dated before the election and even after, like the day after, that is to be considered valid?
It depends on the state. And that may be one of the legal challenges they end up facing. There may be legal challenges if someone's ballot doesn't arrive on election day. For the most part, I think the states are saying it has to be there on election day or it's not going to get counted. But in all likelihood, there will be legal challenges by maybe both candidates to see if those votes can get counted. But they're basically telling people make sure it gets to your polling place, to the election people, on or before November 3rd. And the post office has been sending information to people on make sure you fill it out this way, make sure it gets mailed here, make sure it gets turned in before November 3rd. So there will likely be legal challenges. And it'll be up to the courts to decide whether or not those votes will get counted. If it's because of a delay in the post office, then yeah, those votes will probably get counted because you can't do anything if the post office is delayed. But it's going to depend on the circumstances, I guess. Wish I had a better answer for you on that, but it's just up in the air. Yeah. It's going to be a very odd election. Okay. In terms of socioeconomics, the higher your education level, the more money you make, and the better your job, the more likely you are to participate. If you have a bachelor's degree or higher, if you're making, I'd say at least $50,000 a year, and if you're working in management, you're likely to show up on election day. You're going to have the time to go before or after work. You're going to know how to register to vote, how to find your polling place, what the ballot looks like. And so studies have found that 83% of people who earn over $100,000 a year participate in elections on a regular basis. For people earning less than $20,000, it's about 43% voter turnout. So clearly there is a correlation between income and participation. And again, part of that is the type of work. If you work a 9-to-5 job, you can go before or after work. If you're making $200,000 a year, you can probably afford to hire someone to watch your kids while you go vote. So it's going to be easier, not easy, but easier, if you have a pretty high level job, a fair amount of money. 70% of college graduates vote versus about 50% of the high school diploma. Again, part of that's tied to learning how elections work in college, learning how to find your polling place, how to look at the candidates, and so on. And they also find that people who have a college degree to an associate's or higher are more likely to encourage people to vote. They're going to know more about how politics work, the significance of an election, why it's important to vote. So they're much more likely to encourage their friends and family to show up to vote, to talk to their colleagues and say, let's all go vote at lunch, or go home and go vote with their spouse and kids. My first election at 18, I went with my parents to vote, right? It's easier if you have someone kind of walking you through that process, especially the first time. So there's more participation for people who are college educated in higher income jobs and higher level jobs, which probably isn't that surprising. Out of curiosity, any of you have family members that vote on a regular basis, or sometimes? No? Okay, fair enough. All right, there's also issues with age. Young voters don't necessarily show up. And we saw this in the 2008 election. 44% of voters between 18 to 24 showed up. 70% of people 65 and older showed up to vote. Huge difference, right? Now, we did see high voter turnout for young people in 2008, but it was kind of an anomaly. So what happens is campaigns go after people over the age of 50 because they consistently show up to vote and they show up in high numbers. So 64% of campaign ads are directed at people over the age of 50. Groups like AARP, they have 40 million members, so they run ads on Social Security, health care, Medicare, right, encouraging their members to show up to vote. So you see a lot of ads on prescription drugs, health care, Social Security, but you don't see ads on college tuition, housing, and so on. There have been attempts to get young people to show up to vote through things like Rock the Vote, the registration drives on college campuses, right? We had Ms. Brown in here last week getting people registered to vote. When I was an undergrad, the various campus political student organizations would sit in the student union and get people registered to vote. If you have people going into colleges and even high schools and saying, are you going to be 18 on or before election day, fill out this and we'll help. It also helps if there's the ability to register to vote online. So if you can just take out your phone, go to the website and fill it out, that's pretty easy, right? So online voter registration does help get young people at least registered to vote if not showing up. So there was a lot of support for Obama by young people. About 60%, or sorry, 66% of the youth vote went to Obama in 2008 and 60% in 2012. In 2016, 85% of voters 18 to 29 were supporting Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton. So Bernie Sanders actually had a lot of the youth vote because he was talking about affordable housing, college, student loan debt, etc., right? But because they don't show up to vote in as large numbers, Hillary Clinton got the nomination. So part of the problem is we have to get young people out to the polls. We have to get them to vote. And of course, understandably, your generation is concerned about how do we pay for college? How do we make sure we get a job after we finish? How are we going to be able to raise kids? How do I afford housing? What about the state of the environment, right? There's a lot of very, very valid concerns that aren't being addressed because candidates look at 18 to 25-year-olds and they go, well, they don't vote, so why would I pay attention to them? You don't show up, they're not going to be looking at you. It's also unfortunate that young people do tend to have a very cynical view of politics. 9 out of 10 young people between 13 and 25, when asked, that they would never run for office. Some of that's understandable, right? You can't have to run the gauntlet. You have to be able to raise money. You have to be willing to stand up to personal attacks, scrutinizing of your private life, everything kind of coming back at you. So unfortunately, because we don't see youth voter turnout, candidates focus on the baby boomer generation, and some of the issues that young people are concerned with get pushed to the sideline. Out of curiosity, would any of you consider running for public office one day? No? They're like, nope, absolutely not. Okay. Yeah. I did have a student once who had it all planned out. He was going to join the military, then he was going to go to law school, and then he was going to run for states, and then he was going to work his way up. But most young people are like, no thank you. I don't want to run the gauntlet on that. So out of curiosity, how many of you voted in the 2018 election, midterm election? Okay, how many of you are planning to vote this time around? Okay. Yeah, that's about average. How many of you would consider voting if it was a federal holiday, if you didn't have to go to work or school? A little bit more? Okay. How many of you would consider voting if you got like $20 to do so, if they incentivize voting financially? Okay, yeah, that's understandable, right? And sometimes they do try to incentivize voting. Like, if you run into really long lines, what they'll do is they'll come in with like pizza and stuff like that. Hey, keep waiting in line, we'll feed you guys, we'll give you water. Sometimes they'll do things like, if you stay in line to vote, we'll enter you into a raffle to win a gift card or something like that. So sometimes they do incentivize it a little bit. But you can't necessarily pay people to vote, so that's where it kind of runs into that issue. Okay, any questions, thoughts on this? In terms of some of the precautions I think they're going to try to take for this election, when I voted in the runoff election. What they were doing was spacing out the polling stations, and they were giving people basically like wooden sticks so that you could use the stick to vote instead of using your fingers, so people weren't touching machines. And then they were sanitizing them afterwards. So they are taking precautions to try and deal with the spread. The problem is going to be if there's high turnout on election day, waiting in line, that could get tricky. The actual voting itself, they're being pretty cautious about it. I think what most people are worried about is the wait in line outside. If you're in line with 100 people, that's a little scary right now. So that's part of, I think, what we're seeing in terms of the challenges to voting this time around.
More voting places to have lesser products.
Yeah, no, and it makes absolutely no sense why they're closing polling stations. I know that at least one NBA team has said you can use our arena on election day, which is actually really smart, so you could have a ton of polling stations and you could spread it out. I honestly think that may be the best ways to get people to vote. If you're in a library, it's a small little space. If you're using like soccer or basketball arena, the gym of the high school, something like that, it's probably a bit safer. Yeah. Yeah. It is problematic that we are seeing some polling stations closed during a pandemic. That's not a great sign. On the plus side, we are seeing more people volunteering for elections. Companies like Old Navy have said we'll pay you your regular salary to be a poll worker. Some celebrities are offering money to help get poll workers hired, things like that. So it's a good sign. We're seeing more people wanting to volunteer this time, so maybe it will be a little bit smoother than we're thinking. I'm not keeping my fingers crossed on it, but I think it is a good sign. We are seeing more people volunteering to help out on election day. Maybe that'll help a little bit. And we are going to need volunteers outside to make sure people are spacing out. They may have to put like tape on the ground or something to be like wait behind this line or something like that. Oh, I know. That's why you're going to need people outside being like, eh, move it on back. I know, they're probably not going to witness necessarily, but. And also, I mean, if you're voting with your parents, it's not like you guys need to spread out anyway, right? I mean, if you're looking at home, it's not like it makes a difference, but yeah, no, I agree. It's going to be tricky. Yeah, this is going to be a very weird election. There's been very few elections where we don't know who won on election night. The last one was in 2000 with the butterfly ballots in Florida and that hot mess. Yeah, we're in all likelihood we're going to go to bed on election night with no clear idea of who actually won. It may take a couple of months to find out. But just kind of an interesting factoid, if the election is contested, and if the deadline for the inauguration passes with no clear winner, then the Speaker of the House becomes the temporary president. So Nancy Pelosi would become the interim president until they can decide who actually won. So Trump wouldn't continue serving in office necessarily. It would go to the Speaker of the House, and she would basically serve as the president until they get it sorted out. This is a way of just kind of protecting it to make sure someone doesn't try to stay in office indefinitely. So they use the constitutional triggers to make sure that wouldn't happen. It'll be interesting. We'll have to wait and see what happens on election day and the aftermath and who actually somehow manages to win. I think it's going to be ugly either way. I think it's going to be contentious either way. And I think there's going to be protests either way. So it'll be interesting. Okay. So just as a reminder, the midterm exam will be posted today. It is due on the 8th by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. Open book, open note, short essay exam. So if you have any questions about the exam, you can always email me, call or text my cell phone, or set up an appointment to meet in my office. If you use a source other than the book or the notes, make sure you cite it somewhere in the exam so I know where it came from. So if you look at a website, just make sure, like at the end of the question or something, you let me know where you got it. Also, and I've had this happen, it's rare, but I've had students who accidentally bump into each other and work on the exam together and turn in identical answers. You do that, you're going to lose all the points on the question. I mean, I can't stop you guys from accidentally bumping into each other at Starbucks and saying, let's take a look at the questions together. That's fine. Just don't be like, I'll write questions 1 and 2, you write questions 3 and 4, and we'll share, right? That's not going to be allowed. But otherwise, again, it's open book, open note. Part of the questions will ask for your opinion. There is no right or wrong answer on that part. It's just your opinion. You will only lose points on that part of the question if you don't answer it. You're not going to lose points for expressing an opinion just if you don't answer the question. So don't be afraid to share your thoughts and feelings on that. You won't lose points for an opinion. There's no right or wrong answer on an opinion. Make sure you answer all parts of the question. Make sure you answer all of the questions. I've had students who were numbering it and somehow missed question 3 and went straight to question 4. So double check it before you submit it. If for some reason Blackboard is not working, next week we'll figure out an alternate arrangement for you guys to submit the exam. Okay? Nope, it's you open the questions and you just work on it and you send it back to me, or send it through Blackboard. Okay, any other questions? No? And it's whatever format you guys want. You don't have to have a cover page. You don't have to put my name on it, but if you do, try to spell it correctly or just write Dr. J. And my last name's tricky. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We're going to wrap up chapter 8 next Tuesday, so make sure you read the second half of chapter 8 for Tuesday. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise,